Mama, hast du schon meine Wehrmachtuniform gewaschen?
Ich wasche doch mal helle Wäsche.
Ah, scheiße. Kannst du nicht eine extra Wäsche für mich reintun? Nur diesmal, ich brauch's echt.
Oh, okay. Nur einmal. Diesmal.
Oh, danke, Mama.
Sag mal, läuft deine Kamera?
Oh, scheiße. So, after many of you have speculated about my stance on race, especially my recent one, I've decided to make a video about it. Because heck, I love talking about things that will probably get me kicked off YouTube and every other social media website. Racism, it's an interesting lexeme. I remember being first taught about it when I was a wee little kid, and we were talking about the slave trade, you know, in Africa and all that other shit. So at the time, I only saw racism as a thing that white people did to black people. Despite the fact that I as a kid was racially profiled for being German, for example, I got called a Nazi on the playground, etc., I never actually assumed that that was a case of racism. I just thought, heck, that's just people being assholes, right? Which leads me to think, despite having known what racism was, I still wasn't able to put A and B together. Which then gives me another question to whether or not the term racism actually properly exists. Racism is a made-up word. Well, heck, every word is a made-up word. We use words to explain new things that we describe to often make our lives a heck of a lot easier. And then we use those words to accuse people of things to help our own selfish narrative of getting our point across.
So, like, what did Milo say that was violent in a rape threat?
It is violent. The words that he says, the rhetoric, racist, sexist bullshit, that is violent. Racist, sexist.
The same goes with transphobia, Islamophobia, and many other words that are used for fear-mongering. And words like these all lie under the same hood. They are used to force people to ignore why we might feel uneasy about people that look or are a little bit different. And notice how these words were mostly created by minorities or people who felt oppressed. These words gave people power that would inevitably cause other people a retraction of rights. For example, when we speak of racism, the overuse of the word has allowed affirmative action to be implemented in our society. Or when we use the word sexism, the use of that word has allowed women to gain more custody rights, despite the fact that they probably have been terrible mothers or triggered a divorce for no reason. Obviously, I wouldn't deny that any type of racism is still prevalent in our society, but that's not really my point. My point is, why do we need to use the word racism to describe the development of African or some Middle Eastern countries? Let's look at the continent of Africa, for example. What we're told as wee little youngsters is that the white man has caused every single issue that exists in Africa, and that we are the reason that they are not developed. Could you believe it? Some people actually still think that Africa would look like this if the white man wouldn't have interfered.
Really, nigga?
But what we weren't told as wee little youngsters is that Africans were enslaving, killing, and raping people long before the white man arrived. Despite the aggression probably increasing due to slavery, the white man still did a lot of good things for Africa. Fun story. During the Atlantic slave trade, Europeans could not penetrate into Africa for very long or very far due to the threat of malaria and other tropical diseases. The sailing ships were on a timetable to catch the best winds for the year. They would buy their slaves from blacks on offshore islands. Then they took off before the hurricane season. Blacks were completely complicit in the slave trade and actually benefited from it. For the Americas and Europeans' involvement in it, the slave trade would have not occurred without the black people's permission, including their involvement and approval. Besides, we do forget that it was whites who largely ended slavery. Another fun fact, Arab slave traders had actually enslaved more people than the European slave traders did. Blacks had rounded up one another and sold each other to the Arab slave traders too. Not to mention, us Europeans were also enslaved by the Arabs. Where's our affirmative action? Oh right, white people are fucking terrible, I forgot. Even though it was the British Empire that first abolished the slave trade, losing a heck of a lot of money and lives in the process. But okay. But white men people still ruined Africa. Actually, when the European Empire stepped away from Africa, Africa practically went down the shitter. I mean, who did they elect in their first democratic election? Surely they must have elected someone who liberated the country and proved many rights for blacks. No. Zimbabweans managed to elect a genocidal cockbag, aka Robert Mugabe. I mean, if that's not a case of extreme racism, then what does the word racism even mean? Let us delve into the crime rate of America. About 13% of Americans are black, according to the estimates from the US Census Bureau. And yes, according to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, black offenders committed 52% of homicides. This was in data recorded between 1980 and 2008. Only 45% of the offenders were white. In 2013, the FBI reported that 38% of murders were committed by blacks. However, only 31.1% were committed by whites. In 29.1% of cases, the perpetrator's race was unknown. Over 3 years of data from 2011 to 2013, 38.5% of people arrested for murder, robbery, manslaughter, rape, and aggravated assault were black. This is evidence from official police reports that blacks are more likely to commit crimes than whites. And why is this? Is it the unfair justice system? You guys like to say that, but it's not. In the book of IQ and the Wealth of Nations, it talks about the IQ of the average sub-Saharan African being at 80. The IQ of an African American is normally at 85. White populations in Australia, Canada, New Zealand, Europe, South Africa, and the United States score really close to one another, being at around 100. The reason to why IQ is such an important factor is because a lower IQ causes many detrimental factors in society. These include poverty, dropping out of school, unemployment, divorce and lower rates of marriage, welfare dependency, a child's poor motor skills and development, and criminal behavior. So then, setting out these societal differences, which is backed by data, surely should be common sense, right? Think again, we are still expected to act as if these IQ differences do not exist at all, thus assuming that these societal problems occurring are not a genetic factor, but are blamed on white people as per usual. And if we highlight these slight differences, we are called racist and assholes. However, it is a fact that wherever black people are concentrated in large numbers in the West, they are likely to promote tribal situations, such as gangs, territories, and fights, but for some reason it is still our fault as white people. On average, densely populated black communities show a thirst for tribal mentality, as well as tribal warfare, because it is still white people to blame for a problem that is predominantly genetic. Whites have given many resources to help black communities in the West and even in Africa. However, black communities on average remain unsuccessful in full integrations in civilized communities. It might also be surprising that blacks have a higher self-esteem than whites on average. In one large study of 11 to 16-year-olds, blacks rated themselves as more attractive than did whites. Blacks also rated themselves higher in reading, social studies, and science, but funnily enough, not in mathematics. This inferiority complex leads to the whole "we was kings and shit" debacle. A lot of black people like to assume that they were Egyptian kings, which is funny because it doesn't help the whole slave thing. But nonetheless, they really weren't kings. Near to every single African slave that was brought from Africa to America came from mainly two countries in Africa, Senegambia and Angola. Both of these countries are on the west coast of Africa, and neither of these countries are anywhere near to Egypt. Mitochondrial DNA proves this. Not to mention, a lot of African languages prove that black people lack abstract thinking. As I would like to mention, not all black people lack it. As I said, this is just an average. The English to Zulu language dictionary has only 250 pages. And like the other African Negro languages, it does not include a working definition of any abstract concepts, because technically it's not possible for them to think that way or those communities to have been thinking that way. Obviously, you can then argue why a lot of African Americans are then able to learn English. However, do you remember when I said that the average African American IQ is 15 points higher than that of the sub-Saharan Africans? That could be a reason why. So again, whenever I'm talking about this, it's really important to remember that I am talking about an average. Anyway, that's enough from me. I'm going to be going back to what I can do best, and that is being literally Hitler. And as always, keep memeing and dreaming.